Okay. This is Steve Platek for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. Today I'm talking with Dr. James Russell, Assistant Professor of Biology at Georgia Gwinnett College in Georgia. How you doing, James?
Doing good, Steve.
All right. All right, so why don't you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in studying things from an evolutionary perspective?
Well, I've always been interested in evolution. First time I heard about it in high school, I thought it was a concept that made a lot of sense to me. It wasn't until I was an undergraduate when I started doing research with a professor that my interest really peaked. And I started off in ecology, but I gravitated into the evolutionary field pretty quickly when I started studying sex determination.
Fantastic. And that leads us to our question about your research. Can you tell us a little bit about your latest research on sex determination?
Yeah, so what I've been focusing my work on is what I consider a model evolutionary organism. It's a bacteria that does a lot of different things in insects and nematodes, the most dominant animals in the world. Um, but the one I studied was the phenotype I studied was one in which the bacteria turned males into females, and then those females were capable of cloning themselves, and not just cloning themselves, but cloning themselves and producing more daughters who were also infected with the bacteria who could clone themselves.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that was my, and this is shaping the evolution of many species.
So can you elaborate a little bit on that when you say shaping the evolution of many species? I mean, how is this bacteria that can alter the sex of an organism? Are the organisms just along for the ride?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good question, actually. I wrote an article recently in Heredity where I referred to it as the host was being farmed by the parasite, essentially. The host is kind of into this relationship for the ride. Unfortunately, it's bound now. It's obligate host to this parasite that it depends on for its own reproduction. It's a complicated story, but essentially what it's done is this bacteria has created a situation where certain genes have moved through the population and trapped the host into asexual existence. And since it's asexual, it needs the bacteria to reproduce. It can't reproduce sexually anymore. It's,
And so when I teach about this in my evolutionary class, I teach about the evolution of sex, and I oftentimes come upon the Red Queen hypothesis. And we
Mhm.
talk about the evolution of sexuality or sexual reproduction as a response to pathogen infestation or infection. And now what you're saying is that the pathogens have flipped the coin and turned it back into asexual reproduction. Is there
yeah,
is there a probability that these asexually reproducing wasps wasps now may be subject to the same kind of elimination from another infection because they're clones?
yeah, exactly. They're clones. Yeah, I mean, if the Red Queen is keeping the sexual hosts from being consumed by their parasites, this parasite's the Mad Hatter. I mean, um, turned the tables on the host. It's trapped the host. So here's the deal: if sexuality is the Red Queen response to a parasite infecting it, if that parasite can force asexuality on its host, well, then the host is trapped. It's almost as if the parasite is farming the host. That's a quote that I almost lifted from Lawrence Hurst.
Wow,
Have to give him.
yeah. Wow, that's fantastic. Now, do we see any kind of analogs of this kind of manipulation, which I presume is happening at a genetic level,
Yeah,
in other critters, or is there any kind
yeah,
of
for sure.
relationship you might see in humans?
Well, in humans, it's kind of interesting. This bacteria is not found in humans, but there are other things that are going on in humans that maybe we just don't know that much about. There may be selfish chromosomes. We know that there's selfish DNA littered throughout the human genome, um, and and there are stories of driving chromosomes, things called meiotic drive X chromosomes, that basically kill the Y chromosome. So the whole XY chromosome, the sexual battleground, I call it, is a place where a lot of evolution is taking place. If you look at the fastest evolving genes, you're going to see that they're associated with sexual reproduction, sperm competition, egg-sperm interaction, things like that, as well as host pathogen interactions as well. Now, as far as what I call sex ratio distortion, we don't see that a lot in humans. There are some small examples of that, some kind of just a story here and there. There's a story of Madame B in France, who, in her lineage of grandparents, aunts, and sisters, had, I think, 72 daughters and 0 sons, which suggests that maybe there was a selfish X chromosome there. Now, in other animals, though, this is going on all over the place. The pill bug, the roly-polies that you see rolling around on the ground. Yeah, they're isopods. There's a new sex chromosome evolving in isopods right now because Wolbachia is distorting the sex ratio. It's turning males into females, kind of like it does with the wasps. However, they can't clone themselves.
Okay.
They still need to sexually reproduce. So the population has become so biased, female biased, that selection pressure is very strong to combat this sex ratio bias. So a new male-determining sex chromosome is evolving that can resist the sex distortion of this bacteria. There are butterflies in Africa where the sex ratio is like 95 to 99% female. Well, these butterflies used to display. Males used to flock in these leks and display for the females and fly off and show off their colors. And the females would pick the males that they like, say, oh, that's the one I want, and mate with them. This is a common display in butterflies and birds. But because the sex ratio has shifted so much, behavior has shifted as well. And now females are competing for males' attention. So you have all of these females out displaying, looking for those 1% of males that are left in their population to mate with.
Wow. So it's a buyer's market for the male.
Exactly.
Wow. That's fascinating. And my question was going to be how this drives sexual selection, because you would expect where there's a drastic sex ratio difference, there's going to be alteration in sexual selection, secondary sexual characteristics. And as you've mentioned, the males no longer display. They don't need to.
Yeah, they don't need to. The females are displaying. This is something I'd like some research. I'd kind of like to do. I'm kind of interested to see how this may influence sex ratio decisions. There's something called a stalk-eyed fly, where the males have very long stalks, and some people at the University of Maryland found out that females can select males based on the length of their stalks. But they also found there's a correlation between the length of their stalks and them carrying a selfish genetic element, a sex ratio distorting element as well. So in that sense, it's another way female behavior is changing, and these secondary sexual characteristics are being influenced by these selfish genetic elements as well. So in humans, I know you're interested in.
Well, no, it's not about humans as much as it is about behavior, and that's fascinating. So it suggests that perhaps sexual selection is still working to identify or cue or signal what we call good genes or good genetics in this stalk-eyed fly example. Whereas that if your eyes are too long, you might carry this selfish. So you want to avoid that, and so sexual selection is still trying to sort of arm wrestle its way to sexual reproduction.
Oh yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, yeah, the female that makes the wrong decision in some cases and only produces female offspring or only produces male offspring because she chose the male that had the selfish genetic element, she's going to suffer. That decision is going to be a poor one for her grandchildren. And it's an interesting area of research, something I'd like to maybe look into. I'm kind of interested to see if more animals can recognize selfish genetic elements and if it influences their behavior.
That's
Uh,
interesting. Another question that comes to my mind almost immediately when we have a difference in ratio of something like sex or anything is how does frequency dependent selection play a role in here? I mean, you would expect that it would be advantageous for the species to have roughly a 50-50 sex ratio, and these bacteria are just obliterating that. And how is that having an effect ecologically?
well, there's so a 50-50 sex ratio is yeah, I mean that is applies in most species, not in all species.
Right, right.
So in a lot of close in what's called the local mating environment, like a lot of the wasps I studied, there it's preferentially a female bias, but still with some males. Um, yeah, I mean, frequency dependent selection is going to play a role. I mean, that's a central part of sex ratio selection. So the rarer sex will always be favored. And some people have even said, that's how these sex chromosomes evolved because it's really the best balanced system. Sort of ensures that 50-50 balance. Um, but sex chromosomes are evolving all the time, and it's not only will it provide us a sex ratio balance, but it's also a place of battle where it's a lot easier to get a driving X chromosome to overpower a Y chromosome or vice versa, depending on the circumstances. So, because when you think about it, an X chromosome spends 2/3 of its time in a female and 1/3 of its time in a male.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a balanced environment, a sexual
No.
environment for the X chromosome.
Right. So does that suggest that genomic imprinting is most likely to happen at the sex chromosomes as opposed to other genes?
Ah, yeah. Well, no, I don't think. I think that's no. I don't think that's. I'm not an expert on genomic
Okay.
imprinting, but I don't think so. I think genomic imprinting is it can happen on autosomes because it's the imprint occurs in the body of the gamete maker. So if it's a male, it's going the chromosome doesn't the growth chromosome or whatever chromosome is going to be imprinted. It's not so much a genetic; it's more of an epigenetic effect.
Okay.
So
Okay.
the DNA gets changed as it's being made, so to speak, before it
Yeah.
fertilizes the egg.
Okay.
DNA literally doesn't get changed, but the imprint is just—it's like there's a methyl group that's attached. I think that's how it works.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. I know I told you I wasn't going to ask you about this, but you recently gave a lecture on campus for the Science History Club. GGC has this club, the Science History Club, which has just been absolutely outstanding at providing lectures.
Yeah.
And the topic of it was belief, and you had some really cool things to say about that. And I wonder if you could just give us the 2-minute version
Okay.
of kind of why do you think humans have belief?
Well, it's I'm not. I gotta start off by saying I'm no expert in this field, but it's something I'm very interested in. In fact, I was the one that suggested this whole idea, belief-centered reality. So, okay, here's my take. Here's what I think, based on little research that I've done on this. And imagine I'm going to call this the co-option hypothesis. I'm still working on this,
Okay.
but I think that belief. The one thing that distinguishes humans from other animals, and it's something I'm going to consider here from an evolutionary perspective, is our extremely long development. It takes a long time to raise a human from a newborn baby to some form of independent maturity. Very long, much longer than most other animals. In that extended infancy, that prolonged development, beliefs come in handy. In other words, you want the child to believe its parents. When the parents say, don't go near the water, there are monsters that live in the water, you want that child to accept that belief. When the parent says, don't touch the fire, there's a god of fire that will punish you if you touch the fire, then you want that child to say, okay, I'm not going to go in there because the fire monster is going to burn me. But our ancestors matured. Once they reached a certain age, when they lived in small family clans especially, they had to go out and start facing the big bad world. And those beliefs and those childhood myths would have to give way to the reality of not being eaten and finding something to eat and to keep yourself from starving and to find a mate and reproduce, the basic necessities of life. That's what growing up is all about.
Right.
Our ancestors, in my mind. But if you think about human cultural development, how socially we've evolved, and we've gone from living in small, tight clan, extended family units to slightly larger units to bigger units, until we lived in city states, and now we live in these megalopolises. Development seems to have been kind of prolonged further and further and further. And this ability to retain beliefs, perhaps, has extended further and further and further as well. And I think some of the institutions that we talked about in that meeting have also sort of co-opted this idea of belief and used it for their own purposes to a certain extent, and culturally, said, okay, you've grown up now, but don't give up your beliefs, but believe what we tell you to believe. And maybe that's how we've retained some of the beliefs that our ancestors would have grown out of. But now we live in a world where we can hang on to them longer. We're living longer.
Okay, so just one last question about that, because I've been thinking about this, and I had some major questions at that talk because I found it super fascinating. Could it be the fact that as a consequence of our extended development, sort of pedomorphic type development, that in a sense humans are like the domesticated fox of Russian fur trade, where when you domesticate the fox, all of a sudden he gets a short nose, floppy ears, and spots. He basically looks like a border collie, and he's nice, and he shakes his tail, and he pants at you, and probably will fetch the ball if you train him. Could it be something like that, where we've got this essentially prolonged development under domestication that makes us, for lack of better terminology, susceptible to belief? And I like your idea of a co-option hypothesis, that these institutions now, yes, humans have belief, but believe what we tell you to believe because we say so.
Yeah. Or for social control, or for some sort of restraint on personal, decision making.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I like the domestic fox analogy. I think we're talking about the same thing essentially here. It's just this kind of a Peter Pan world now of we're not going to grow up. We're always going to keep those beliefs further. We're not having to face the hardcore selective pressures that our ancestors faced.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong. Hunting and gathering I'm kind of glad with some of the creature comforts I have.
Right.
But I'm just saying maybe that's why we have this ability. We still want to believe in things, and we're susceptible to that because it's useful in our youth.
Excellent. Well, James, I can't thank you enough for being with me today. The video cast of this will be reviewed by the editors of the magazine and maybe be up in a month or so, and I'll let you know when that happens, okay?
Okay, man. Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right, thanks a lot.